Hi, class. We're back with chapter 15 titled Finding My Voice. Before we get into the reading, let's look at chapter 15, structured notes. Chapter 15 is from pages 239 through 254. You're going to want to provide at least 2 to 3 bullet points here for the gist of chapter 15. And there's only one question for this chapter. Why is this chapter titled Finding My Voice? And let's get into our reading. Finding My Voice, Chapter 15 of A Mighty Long Way. Soon after Daddy died, I received a letter from Elizabeth Huckabee, the former vice principal for girls at Central. She was working on a book about that tumultuous 1957-58 school year, and she wanted some input from my eight comrades and me. I read the letter and put it aside. Those memories were buried deep in my past. I didn't want to think about them. I didn't want to relive them. I never responded to Mrs. Huckabee's letter. It had nothing to do with her. I just couldn't. I didn't hear any more about the project until 1981 when I heard advertisements for the made for television movie Crisis at Central High. The movie was based on Mrs. Huckabee's manuscript, which had not yet been published, and it was about to air on CBS. By then, Ike's job had relocated us to Atlanta, and the children were in school there. Just days before the movie was scheduled to air, I talked to Ike, who agreed that we needed to have a family meeting. Whitney was in the fourth grade then, old enough to understand. Brooke was just 6. We sat down together as a family, and Ike and I talked to them about the Little Rock Nine, my role in the movie that was about to air. On the night of the movie, we planned to watch it together, but I couldn't sit still. I was washing and folding clothes, and I kept leaving the room to start a new load, put away a bundle, and push down any old emotions trying to resurface. Ike was teary eyed. Whitney heard my name. Mommy, is that you? He asked. It was a young actress pretending to be me when I was a little girl, I explained. He was full of questions. Why did the people look so mean? Why were they saying those things to me and my friends? Was I scared? Brooke was quieter and less curious about the movie, which suited me just fine. But I listened to Whitney and answered every one of his questions. I kept my answers short, child appropriate, and unemotional. Whitney would be in high school, and our family would be back in Denver before we ever discussed Central High School again. But after putting the children to bed, I thought about what I had seen on television. I thought the movie had done a good job of capturing the tension and upheaval of that awful year. It was told through Mrs. Huckabee's eyes, and she was the central character. History had catapulted her into the center of this drama, and she had a right to share her story, something so far from my mind at the time. Actor Joanne Woodward was convincing as Mrs. Huckabee, but I thought the Hollywood actor character was a bit too compassionate. I respected Mrs. Huckabee because she was fair, efficient, and a great manager. She kept up with us, tracked down the troublemakers who could be identified and punished them, which drew the ear of the segregationists to her. But I never sensed from her the kind of warmth I saw in the movie. I didn't suspect that her stern, businesslike manner had anything to do with race, though. It was just her way. In the days after the movie, I heard from a few friends, mostly those who already knew my story. They said they were amazed by what we went through and didn't believe they could have put up with that kind of treatment. But the buzz over the movie soon died down and again pushed Central out of my mind. Mrs. Huckabee's book by the same name was released after the movie, but I didn't read it. Again, I wanted to stay as far away from that time in my life as possible. Mother and I didn't discuss the movie either. She too was reluctant to talk about the painful parts of our past, but she maintained close ties to Little Rock. She traveled there more frequently than I, and she had a network of friends and relatives in Denver who had moved from Little Rock. They even formed a Dunbar alumni club. She looked forward to traveling each summer with members of the group to the Dunbar reunion, a huge affair held in different cities every 2 years. I occasionally accompanied Mother there. Sometimes I saw Mrs. Mounts, Herbert's mother, but then a retired special education teacher. She always updated me on the accomplishments of her 9 children. The son who had become a college professor, the one promoted to university dean, and the others excelling in their careers. But when she got to her oldest son, her face lit up as she said, "But I'm especially proud of Herbert." He had gotten married, moved to Detroit, and was working in the automotive industry, she said. I even saw Herbert briefly in the mid 1980s when the Dunbar Alumni Group in Denver hosted the reunion, and he and several of his brothers accompanied their mother. But I was busy helping to coordinate the festivities for the 800 alumni who attended. So Herbert and I didn't get to spend any time together. I knew what I needed to know, that Herbert had refused to let the trouble in Little Rock ruin his life. For years, that knowledge was enough. I didn't need to know the details of his arrest and prison time. I still believed he was innocent, and it brought me comfort to know that he was all right, that he had somehow found a way to move on. I thought I had moved on too. I had opened my own business as a real estate broker and was volunteering as a board member of the Colorado AIDS Project. This was the 1980s when AIDS was a mysterious disease sweeping through the country, wiping out primarily young gay men in the prime of their lives. Hysteria over the disease was so rampant that our organization didn't even put the address of our headquarters on correspondence because we feared it might be bombed. A neighbor who was on the board recruited me, and I was eager to try to help relieve the suffering when I saw so many young people dying throughout the country. Discrimination against the gay community was widespread, and those suffering from the disease were often forced from their homes and jobs and abandoned by family members and friends. Our group ran a food pantry and provided case management and a volunteer buddy to those who needed companionship and help determining and balancing their healthcare needs. Through my work on the board, I found a way to fight injustice. Few knew just how much my own past helped me identify with those who were hurting. I soon learned, though, that burying a painful past doesn't necessarily mean you've moved beyond it. It's often still there, simmering, waiting for some unexpected moment to erupt, spewing forth every hurtful thing that you thought had gone away. That's what happened in 1987 when the Little Rock Nine gathered in Little Rock as guests of the NAACP for the 30th anniversary of our landmark school desegregation fight. It was an emotional reunion because it was the first time that all 9 of us had come together since Central. I've seen Ernie regularly at Michigan State and stayed in contact with him on and off afterward. I've seen Terry, Jefferson, and Melba once or twice over the years, too. Several of us also had gotten together in New York to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the groundbreaking 1954 U.S. Supreme Court decision that had made it possible for us to attend Central High School. I was able to keep an emotional distance from the past in New York, but keeping those memories buried would be more difficult in Little Rock. I hadn't been back to Central since I graduated. At first, it felt good to see so much positive change. The student body president of Central, an African American male, greeted the 9 of us in the classroom that had served as the chapel and a haven for us in the morning before class 30 years earlier. We also were welcomed home by the new African American mayor, Lottie Shackelford, who had been in Ernie's class at Horace Mann. But when we moved into the freshly scrubbed halls, I couldn't escape the old ghosts, the noise, the angry white faces, the slimy spit. They were right there in my face. The next thing I knew, the usually cool, calm, and collected Carlotta was outside, standing under those granite goddesses, gasping for air, unable to stop the tears from flowing. I knew then there would be no stuffing all of that hurt back inside. I had to find a way to make peace with my past. First and most important, I reconnected with my 8 comrades for good. The 9 of us spent hours together catching up on our post central lives, our families, careers, and future plans. We exchanged telephone numbers and addresses and promised to stay in touch, a promise I'm proud to say we've kept. There are only 8 other people in this world who know exactly what happened to us at Central and how it felt. It helped to be able to pick up the telephone, call one of them on a particularly bad day. It felt good to share our evolving lives. When I returned from Little Rock, I began getting calls from longtime friends, acquaintances, and even neighbors in Denver who had seen a report about the reunion on CNN. They all wanted to know, why didn't you tell us? I've known you 20 years and you never said a word, one friend told me. At a neighborhood Christmas party, one of the neighbors commented, I didn't realize we had a celebrity living among us. They all assumed I was just being humble. There was no explaining how desperately I had needed to forget. Several strangers looked up my number in the telephone directory and invited me to speak in their churches, communities, and schools. I didn't return calls and tried to ignore the invitations, but one history teacher was particularly persistent. She taught at Ponderosa High School in Parker, Colorado, a Denver suburb, and she kept calling. We were peers, she said. She remembered the stories about the Little Rock Nine, and this would be a way to make history come alive for her students. That sold me. I also reconsidered an interview request that I had initially turned down from a reporter at the Denver Rocky Mountain News. I called him back and agreed to allow him to sit in the class when I spoke. That way, I figured I could avoid a direct interview. I didn't have a canned speech and just talk to the students from my heart. I tried to connect to them by reminding them that I was their age when I made the decision to attend Central. One boy told me my story sounded surreal. There was no way they would not have fought back, several of them said. I talked to them about what life was like for Southern blacks at that time. I told them that my 8 comrades and I had been ingrained with the knowledge that we were as close as some white people would get to people of our race, and that we were expected to maintain our dignity no matter what. We just had to have faith that justice would prevail. I'd like to think I helped the students put a face on the story they had read in the book and help them to understand the human toll. But even more, I hope I've left them with the message that heroism starts with one brave decision to do the right thing. Afterward, I even talked to the reporter who asked where my children had gone to school. When I told them that they had spent their first years in Jefferson County, one of the top school districts in the state, he recognized that the schools in the district were largely white. I told him that my family had moved out of the suburbs into southeast Denver and the public schools there in 1977. That was too bad, the reporter responded, because white kids needed to go to school with black kids. The reporter, who was white, said he had a child and was beginning to realize how much his child needed to be exposed to people of other races and cultures. I hope I helped him to understand that diversity is at least a two-way street. It doesn't belong just on the shoulders of African American children and their families. White families who believe in the ideas of a multiracial society have to be willing to make some tough choices and sacrifices too. What I didn't explain was that Ike and I had decided to move out of our neighborhood in Lakewood and back into Denver because Whitney was one of just two or three black students in his entire school. I had lived that experience, and my natural instinct was to protect my child. While he was never mistreated the way I had been, I knew how isolating such a situation could be. Our society, even a place as progressive as Denver, had not yet evolved to the point that race didn't matter. And I did not want my child to internalize that something was wrong with him because he looked different from his classmates. Ike and I also chose not to move to a largely black section of Denver either. We wanted Whitney to grow up knowing and interacting freely with people of all races. We moved to southeast Denver, which was relatively diverse. The children in my new neighborhood, white and black, were bused to a school with a predominantly Hispanic population outside of the neighborhood for the purpose of integration. I don't like busing. As a parent, I would have preferred a neighborhood school, but busing was a means to an end, and that end, integration and diversity, was purposeful enough for me to make that personal sacrifice. After the speaking engagement in Ponderosa High School, the invitations to speak kept coming, including one from a friend of my son. The two teenagers were at Cherry Creek High School one day when Whitney's friend read a story about the Little Rock Nine and saw a picture of me. "Isn't this your mom?" he asked Whitney. When Whitney told him that the photo was indeed me, the friend asked if I could come to their school to speak. Whitney rushed home with the invitation, and I, of course, agreed. I began accepting speaking engagements more frequently. I thought it gradually would become easier, but the opposite was true. The more I talked about Central and Little Rock, the more I remembered, and the tougher it got. From time to time, a new memory would come forth from some long hidden place, and the tears would start to flow. Once during a speech, I mentioned Chief Smith, and suddenly that old headline flashed in my head: Police Chief kills wife, takes own life at home. I suddenly remember how devastated and guilty I'd felt, and how skeptical I had been of the official version of his death. My voice began to quiver, and I had to step aside to compose myself. The flashbacks and tears were scary to me at first, given my tendency toward restraint. But throughout the 1990s, I kept going, kept speaking. I also tried to stay close to Big Daddy, who in 1995 turned 100 years old. For his birthday, my sisters and I traveled to the Department of Veterans Affairs home in Seattle, where Big Daddy was living at the time. The staff had a big birthday party for him, and he seemed to be happy. His health was failing, though. Big Daddy had been suffering from dementia for years. He had been forced to close his businesses in Little Rock more than a decade earlier when he walked out one day without locking up, and relatives found him lost, wandering around downtown. By his 100th birthday, Big Daddy had been living in Seattle about 10 years. His speech was impaired, but he wore a big smile and seemed to recognize my sisters and me. As I looked at him that day, I felt such peace. Big Daddy had reached his goal. He told me many times throughout my childhood that he planned to live to be at least 100 years old. I never forgot that, and I protected him fiercely. When a serious bout with pneumonia had threatened his life at age 97, it seemed to me the hospital was considering his age and holding back treatment. I sent word to the doctors that my Big Daddy fully intended to live past 100 and that somebody had better give him antibiotics right away. The medication worked and Big Daddy recovered. He survived 5 more years. On May 1st, 1997, Big Daddy slipped away. I was in awe of him. He had lived to see 102. The year Big Daddy the year before Big Daddy died, I got word that the city of Little Rock was planning a huge commemoration for the 40th anniversary of the integration of Central. There was vigorous debate about the appropriateness of such a celebration, whether the city should spend such time and energy focusing on the ugliest chapter of its history. The local chapter of the NAACP even argued that the commemoration was more a public relations stunt than a meaningful effort at racial reconciliation. I disagreed. I thought it was a good idea to recognize the 40th anniversary in such a special way. I wanted to see Little Rock acknowledge its past, as ugly as it was, but it was equally important to me that participants in the commemoration not get stuck there. I saw it as a positive step that the city wanted to showcase how much had indeed changed. I called my 8 comrades and suggested that we meet to talk. As I saw it, the time had come for us to take as much control as possible of our own legacy. We have been complaining for years about people putting money into their pockets by using our name and images to publicize events that we knew nothing about and to sell all kinds of t shirts and trinkets. We needed to do what we could to assure that we were educating the next generation about the Little Rock Nine and the importance of education. We needed to make sure that our name was associated with good. 8 of us were able to meet later in Las Vegas. I pitched the idea of starting the Little Rock Nine Foundation. Through the foundation, we could give back to the community as a group and continue the journey that we had started so many years ago toward academic excellence and equity. We're grown now, and it's time to stop complaining about people using us. I told my comrades, let's take control of our own name and get on the same page about what we accept and not. We agreed that we would participate as a group in the commemoration. We also agreed to create the foundation as a means to do our part in helping to advance the principle of academic excellence. Several of us volunteered to kick off fundraising for the foundation by donating a percentage of any speaking fees and honorariums. The group assigned me the task of taking care of the necessary business, including obtaining nonprofit status and establishing our name, the Little Rock Nine, as a registered trademark. I had just started the process of officially establishing the foundation when the 40th anniversary rolled around. Indeed, the commemoratorium was as big as we had imagined. A committee had planned more than a week of receptions, lectures, honors, and appearances, which drew a host of dignitaries, including one from the nation's highest elected office, Arkansas's native son, Bill Clinton, who was nearing the end of his first presidency. Of all the wonderful events that week, the image in my head of the ceremony at the school on September 25th, 1997, exactly 40 years after we first marched up the front steps into Central, will stay with me forever. Thousands of people of all races, local residents, as well as guests from all over the world, assembled at the school to welcome the nine of us home. They applauded and stood to their feet as we were presented. Then the nine of us ascended the steps to the front entrance of our alma mater. President Clinton and Governor Mike Huckabee were waiting there and held open the door for us, a gesture that touched all nine of us deeply. 40 years earlier, we had entered those doors under the protection of gun toting federal troopers against the will of the state's segregationist governor. Now the President of the United States and a very different Arkansas governor stood at the door to usher us through. There were few dry eyes among us. This time, though, I was shedding tears of joy. I was grateful that so much of my family had come to witness the events, my husband and children, mother, my sisters, Aunt Emmy, and others who had supported me as much as they could over the years. I also enjoyed meeting the children of my 8 comrades. I wish Daddy and my grandfathers could have been there to see how much things had changed. I especially missed Daddy during the program later that evening at the Excelsior Hotel, now the Peabody, where our parents and Mrs. Bates were honored. Hillary Clinton presented plaques to them. Until that day, our mothers and fathers had never been formally recognized. Melba gave a moving speech about their role. It was good to see Mrs. Bates during the festivities. I hadn't seen her in many years. She was in a wheelchair, but she looked well. I'd heard that she had fallen on difficult financial times and even faced the threat of losing her home after the death of Mr. Bates in 1980. That saddened and frustrated me, and I did what I could to help with Ernie when Ernie rallied to try to save the home where so much of our history had taken place. It eventually was declared a National Historic Landmark maintained by the National Park Service, which allowed it to remain a private residence. When I saw her at the reception, I walked over and embraced her. She had suffered a stroke and had difficulty speaking, so we said little, but her eyes told me that she was happy to see me too. During the same reception, my husband told me that there was another woman in a wheelchair who was eager to see me. He led me to her, and I was surprised to see that it was Elizabeth Huckabee. We both smiled, and I extended my hand to her. She clasped it tightly. She too looked well, and I was glad to see her. We spent some time catching up on each other's lives. I felt good about how well the nine of us were doing in our lives. We were raising families, giving back to the community in myriad ways, and enjoying success in our various careers. I have been in business as an independent real estate broker for the past 20 years. Cool headed Ernie had earned a master's degree in sociology after Michigan State, had worked in the Carter administration, and was rising up the corporate ladder in the finance industry at Lehman Brothers. He was based in Washington. Melba, who seemed born for the spotlight, earned a graduate degree in journalism from Columbia University. worked as a reporter for NBC TV and a communications consultant, and had recently authored a successful memoir about her experiences at Central. She was living in San Francisco. Gloria, the brainy one, had graduated from the Illinois Institute of Technology with a degree in math and chemistry and moved to Sweden to work as a systems analyst and technical writer for IBM. While there, she also became a patent attorney and later founded and edited her own magazine, Computers and Industry. She was living and working in the Netherlands. Terence, a philosopher and professor, long before he got the degrees to back it up, earned a bachelor's in sociology from California State University, a master's in social welfare from UCLA, and a doctorate in psychology from Southern Illinois University. He was living and working in Los Angeles as a college professor and clinical psychologist. Jefferson, the perpetual jokester of the group, earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from Los Angeles State College, served his country in Vietnam, and was working as a government accountant in Columbus, Ohio. Minnie Jean, who had become famously known for fighting back that first year at Central with the so-called Chili incident, attended Southern Illinois University, earned a bachelor's degree, and moved to a farm in Ottawa, Canada, with her husband and 6 children. She worked as a writer and social worker and got involved in grassroots human rights groups. Thelma, quiet and fragile because of a heart condition, had earned bachelor's and master's degrees in education from Southern Illinois University. She worked 27 years as a home economics teacher in St. Louis before retiring in 1994. And then there was Elizabeth, who had been the most scared among us by the events of 1957. The image of her alone, surrounded by the shrieking mob, has endured more than any other as a testament of the courage it took to survive that year. She attended college in Tennessee and Ohio and served in the Army before returning to Little Rock to work for a state welfare agency. But Elizabeth struggled mightily to find her way out of the darkness of the past. In 1996, when the 7 of us had appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show with some former white classmates to discuss the first year of integration at Central, Elizabeth refused to join us. When we gathered again for the anniversary, it was clear to me she was still battling old ghosts. The 9 of us had agreed with Newsweek magazine to be interviewed for a cover story about the anniversary. But once we all got there, Elizabeth suddenly backed out. The reporter turned to me for help in changing her mind. I went to talk to her. We needed to do this for a number of reasons, I told her, but most importantly because we wanted to tell our own stories and set the historical record straight. Carlotta, I just don't think I can get through it, Elizabeth responded. I know how you feel, I told her, but if I sit with you, will you do it? She agreed. Melba also offered to sit with her for the interview. In an empty banquet room at the Excelsior Hotel, Melba and I sat on each side of Elizabeth and almost had to hold her up as she recalled that terrifying moment when she found herself alone, surrounded by a threatening white mob. Newsweek has sent one of its top photographers, and we spent about 2 hours with him snapping pictures of us all around the school. As it turned out, though, we were bumped off the cover of the magazine by CNN founder Ted Turner, who'd announced the week before the anniversary that he was donating $1 billion to charity. Our story ended up as a nice centerpiece. Another enduring photo was snapped at the reunion of Elizabeth and Hazel Bryan Macery, one of the white tormentors in that iconic photograph from 1957. Hazel had called Elizabeth in the 1960s to apologize for tormenting her that day, and photographer Will Counts, who had taken the original photograph of Elizabeth and the mob with Hazel at its center, arranged for the two women to meet at the 40th reunion. The meeting would lead to what seemed to me an odd friendship between Elizabeth and Hazel, who together made television appearances and speeches about their newfound relationship. There was even talk of a contract between the two to do a book and movie together. While I believe in forgiveness and reconciliation, I was suspicious from the start. I wondered whether the kind of contrition making headlines was sincere and worried that Elizabeth might get hurt. I shared my concerns with her, but initially, Elizabeth, who even during our worst times at Central tried to find the good in our tormentors, was excited and believed Hazel to be sincere. But Elizabeth later told me that Hazel was growing tired of being seen as the bad guy as they told their story from place to place. The two women would go their separate ways. The reconciliation photo, which was made into a poster while the two were on the speaking circuit, is still sold with other Little Rock Nine memorabilia. But Elizabeth insisted that a sticker bearing a quote from her be attached to each one. The sticker says, "True reconciliation can occur when we honestly acknowledge our painful but shared past." After the 40th reunion, the honors kept coming. Just 2 years later, President Clinton awarded the nine of us the nation's highest civilian honor, the Congressional Gold Medal. But 4 days before we were set to travel to the nation's capital with our closest family members to accept the award, I received a call from Ernie, who had bad news. Mrs. Bates had died. We mentioned to the family members planning her funeral that we were set to receive the Congressional Gold Medal on November 9th in hopes that they would choose a different day for the funeral. They did not, forcing us to make a difficult decision. With so much federal red tape involved in the medal ceremony, I knew there was zero chance of getting it postponed. Mrs. Bates would want us to accept the award, I figured. When we were kids, she had escorted us to so many such events herself, and in one case, she'd even insisted that she receive the honor too. Ernie came up with a solution. He would fly to Little Rock the morning of the funeral and represent the nine of us by laying a wreath on the bier of Mrs. Bates' coffin as she lay in state. He would then return to Washington in time for the early afternoon medal ceremony. Everything went as planned. When it was time to bestow the awards, President Clinton captured what many of us in the room felt. "This is a special day for me, a happy day and a sad day and emotional day," he said, calling Mrs. Bates a good friend to Hillary and me. He told a story about the day he wheeled Mrs. Bates around the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis when the exhibit on Central High School was dedicated. She was greatly amused when she saw that it featured a statue of Governor Faubus on one side and her on the other, he recalled. And even though by then she had to get around in a wheelchair, she got a big laugh out of that, he said. And what a laugh she had. President Clinton shared the same story with a larger audience the following April when we all attended a memorial service for Mrs. Bates in Little Rock. The service drew an overflow crowd of local and national political and civil rights leaders, as well as local residents who remembered the woman who had dared to stand up to Jim Crow. This time, my comrades asked me to speak on behalf of the nine of us. I recalled how Mrs. Bates had hired me as a 10-year-old paperboy to deliver her and her husband's Arkansas State Press, and how she used the newspaper as an instrument of hope, as well as a megaphone to protest the injustices endured by the Black community. I talked about our transition from news messengers to newsmakers as the story of the Little Rock Nine played out around the world. I also thanked her for the role she had played in supporting the nine of us and our parents as we fought for justice and the delivery of education in this country. On a more lighthearted note, the audience laughed when I said that Thurgood Marshall, Roy Wilkins, and newsman Ted Poston discovered the hard way that you didn't want to play poker with Daisy Bates if you intended to win. Mrs. Bates walked the talk of freedom for all, strode confidently forward, aware of the dangers she faced, but determined to see the walls of segregation come tumbling down. I said, "This is the Daisy Bates that the Little Rock Nine remembers. This is the woman who put her life on the line for the cause of justice. This is an American whose vision for educational equality moved our nation forward. As I took my seat, I thought about the irony of the moment. While we were at Central, I would have been the last one Mrs. Bates asked to speak for the group. She knew me well enough to know that I shunned the limelight. But here I stood before an esteemed crowd, bidding a final farewell to the one who for many years had spoken for my comrades and me. Here I stood on my own, speaking for us all, finally confident in the voice emerging from within. Oh, beautiful. Finding my voice. That was chapter 15, class. We'll be back with chapter 16 tomorrow. Peace at last.